Ladies and gentlemen, it's always a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate Lynn organizing this. I was here, maybe before I forget, again, thank the organization. I come to Australia frequently, and right now with the situation back home, I actually prefer to just stay here forever. So Hans was telling me that he changed citizenship, and I'm envious. But anyway, putting that aside, I'm here to share some of my current thinking, and I apologize. I think Wayne was with me at a different event yesterday, and I'm going to recycle some of the material. So, Wayne, you're perfectly okay to check your email and pay no attention because you already heard most of it. Although I'll give it a little different spin for this particular audience. I'm really here to get your feedback for what I have to say and make note of it, because I'm working actually on a project. I'll say a little bit about it. In fact, if anyone in the audience is interested to collaborate in what I'm about to present, I'm really on a mission to get people to collaborate with me, and I'll talk I'll mention that a little bit as we go. So I think the first good news for an organization that represents and supports consumers, I believe, is the first bullet. I think no pun intended, the balance of power is shifting towards consumers. I'm really convinced of this, and we just have to, as organizations such as this, we have to find ways to educate them and get them more engaged in the market in ways that I think are very exciting and very promising. And as other people are probably aware, I'm now focused primarily at the space that I call behind the meter. And somebody I was talking to recently said, you got to think about without the meter, not just behind the meter, because we are at the verge of basically being able to bypass some of the things that we've been attached to for so long. And I'm also interested in innovation and disruption that is taking in this industry, and particularly, I think, not only am I interested in individual consumers acting more, becoming more engaged in the market, but I think what is really exciting is an aggregation of consumers. When you add up the numbers, you can do things that are much more interesting and much more profound than just having individual consumers doing interesting things, even though that is obviously worth doing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I am very interested in trading and virtual power plants and platforms and things like that, all of which I think will enable not just individuals, but collection and communities of individuals to interact and trade and do interesting things which are difficult to do today or has been in the past. So I start with a few questions. I think these were the bullets on the announcement that went around, so I thought it's a good way to put the questions up and then try to answer them after I make my few remarks. So those are the questions. I won't belabor it right now. We'll come back to it towards the end after, as I said, after I kind of give you my 2 cents worth of what I'm thinking about. So putting things in perspective, I actually flew in to Sydney from Johannesburg. I was at a conference there, and then there was a conference yesterday, and from here I'm going to, believe it or not, Cartagena in Latin America. And the topics are virtually the same. Everybody wants to know how this industry is changing, why, and where are we going to end up. And frankly, some countries are far ahead, and I believe this country is far ahead, and everybody I talk to tells me that that's the case. This country is the most decentralized. It's got the highest penetration of PVs. It's got fairly high rates. Consumers don't seem to trust or like their traditional suppliers. infrastructure to put in solar panels and batteries and so forth seems to be working. It's the perfect climate. It's got all the ingredients that you need to sort of cut the cord, if you will, or at least use the cord less frequently than you did in the past. So I'll mention a little bit that, I'll give you a little bit of the background, then I'll talk about what I think is really exciting, which is the stuff behind the meter and aggregation and so forth. And then a few words about a topic of that is near to me, basically the migration of consumers from being totally dependent on the network and a single supplier and upstream generation and things like that to consumers who are different, let's say, and maybe ultimately will become non-sumers. So for those of you who know me or have known me, I have done I've edited a number of books. These are some of the, I think the first one on the top was in 2006, and you can see the topics have changed. My interest and focus has changed as time has gone by. But more recently, I've become interested in what's happening at the consumer side. So I started looking at distributed generation. Then I looked at what the impact of that might be on utilities and the business models that they have. And then the more recent one, and I have a copy of that book, which I have to decide who to give it to as a gift before I take it back, because the next one is coming out, and I need to get rid of my supply. So the next one, which is finished in terms of manuscript, and it's in public, hopefully will come out early next year, is got this topic. So you can see I'm getting focused more and more on the transition of consumers to these new. But having finished this, I'm now working on my next book, which for planning purposes is going to be called Behind and Beyond the Meter or something like that. But usually the marketing people at Elsevier decide what the final title is going to be based on what they think will be more marketable. Anyway, and this is the part where all of these books I've done collaboratively, so I collect usually 20 plus chapters from different authors and different experts around the world, by the way. So these books tend to cover quite a bit of space in terms of different flavors of what's happening in, say, America or Europe and Australia, certainly, and occasionally other countries as well. But this one I'm going to do a little differently. I'm actually going to make an effort to go to different places and basically organize more of these types of seminars and get groups of people interested in these types of topics to perhaps share their ideas, what research they're doing, what they're finding, and possibly even contributing a chapter to the book. So that's why this is called for papers, if you will. So if anybody's interested, please let me know and we can talk about it. Now, I'm trying to kind of get myself invited back. Lynn, are you paying attention? There's an event apparently in February, right? And I'm a very opportunistic kind of guy, so I try to find more than one thing to do when I make these long trips. It's very grueling to travel these long distances. But in February, if that event, in fact, I get invited to that event, maybe I also visit Melbourne, and I know some people there that are interested, or maybe we get them to come and visit here. And I have other events, which some of the dates you can see, and I'm going to go around places where the action is, and the action is in everywhere, frankly, maybe with the exception of Africa and Latin America, where they're still sort of catching up with the stuff. So that's a little bit of advertisement, and by all means, if anybody here is interested vaguely in what I'm talking about, let's communicate. So very briefly, what after having given this to you, what is the driver of change? And everybody talks about the 3Ds. So I'm going to briefly cover what I think everybody already knows. Decarbonization, I think, is obviously happening to different degrees in different parts of the world. I come from California. On 10th of September, our governor signed Assembly, or actually Senate Bill 100. And 100 means 100% renewable. That's why the number is 100. So California is going for 100% renewable or carbon-free. It's not 100% clear what that exactly means, by 2045. So that was passed and signed into law. That cannot be changed or easily changed. But on the same date, the governor signed an executive order, which is not a law, asking actually the state to become, the entire economy of California to become carbon neutral by 2045. So this is far more aggressive. It's not just electricity being 100% renewable, but the 5th largest economy in the world capturing as much carbon as it puts out, which is quite interesting. So I come from that background, and of course, in California, like everywhere else, there are a lot of people who say, "Well, what is this problem we're trying to solve? There's no problem with the climate, and let's not worry about it," and so forth. Other people say California, I think my numbers may be off, but something like emits 2% of global carbon. So if it does what it is planning to do, it's 2% of global carbon emissions are gone. But what are you going to do with the other 98%? And many countries, and we know a few, don't seem particularly interested in solving the other 98% of the problem. So anyway, there's some symbolism involved. It's not clear whether the governor is just trying to leave a legacy, and whether it's going to be a good, bad legacy, and so forth. So that's as much as I'm going to say about decarbonization. The decentralization, I'm preaching to the choir. This country has more solar panels on the roof than we have in California. But California, I think, has at least 700,000 and counting. And many people, when they do put panels on the roof, they actually put quite a few on the roof. And so in the process, they become more than prosumers. They actually become net, in many cases, they become net producers of kilowatt hours, such as this is around my neighborhood. So this is an interesting thing, and we can talk about that a little more. And of course, digitalization, what does that mean? Well, it means that it's easy, or relatively easy, or a lot easier than it used to be, not only to monitor individual meters, but devices within and beyond the meter, which is what I'm interested in. So I think those are all interesting things. But what is really interesting is not the 3Ds. I mean, those are the fundamental drivers, I believe. But what is really interesting, as I said, back to what I said earlier, is behind the meter, and then aggregation and optimization and monitoring of whole bunch of assets behind the meter, which are now possible, and different startups are now beginning to actually achieve this. So I have many examples, and if there's time and interest, I can kind of give you some flavor of that. But anyway, to put it very simply, if you look at a textbook or go to Google, a picture of electric power industry, or look it up anywhere else, you get, this is the picture that for the 100 years we kind of looked at. We said, big power plants, transmission lines, poles and wires, and the story kind of ends at a house or at the meter. The industry, I used to work for the industry. We really, that was the barrier. We didn't go inside or beyond the meter. It was none of our business. The customer was whatever they did with the kilowatt hours, once it was delivered to the meter and the company got a register of how many spins was being registered, that was it. It was up to you to use it or not use it, or abuse it or waste it or whatever. That was the way it was. And the industry switched on and off all those things on the upstream side to make sure that customers were never inconvenienced, basically. Which in a way was good. You didn't have to worry about it. Lights stayed on. But I think in the future, and this is not a particularly good slide, but you kind of get the flavor of it. I think 20 years from now, if somebody says, what does the electric power sector look like? I think people would probably show you something like this. They would show you some sort of distributed generation, maybe a PV panel, feeding the network, as I showed you in my example, and storing some of it in the battery, and by the way, serving some of the load. So the center of gravity, the whole way of looking at where electrons flow and where the system sort of operates, I think, and I may be wrong, and as I said, this is not going to happen uniformly everywhere around the world. There are many places where probably this model is not fit. But I think in a place like Australia, we're beginning to see this is the kind of emerging picture. And anyway, I like to ask you whether you agree with it or not. But so people ask, okay, it's not a big deal. Okay, tell me, behind the meter. You tell me that's important. What is behind the meter? Well, in the future, in like California, where we want to be carbon neutral, behind the meter basically is any device that uses energy, not just necessarily electricity, because everything has to become electric, right? Otherwise, you're not going to get to where the governor wants us to go. So everything that uses energy essentially is behind the meter. And of course, you can generate behind the meter. There are lots of people interested and excited about electric vehicles. Again, coming back to California, I don't want to say that necessarily we're smarter or ahead or whatever. We're perhaps a little more crazy than some other places. But the governor also wants to have 5 million electric vehicles on California roads by 2025. So he's pushing for infrastructure to be able to serve that many cars and so forth and so on. And then distributed storage. There is a lot of interest and there's a lot of promise that storage will in fact become cheaper as more people begin to use it and as lots and lots of research is going into different forms of storage. So this picture is perhaps not unrealistic for places like that. And this one actually was a chart that Bloomberg Energy News, New Energy Finance, or whatever they're called, they showed at the conference several months ago when I was back here in Sydney at the Clean Energy Summit. That just kind of threw me away. 20 by 2035 or sometime like that, something like 40% of generation capacity in Australia would be behind the meter. I mean, that is a pretty stunning number. So anyway, if you have a lot of these so-called prosumers, the issue, and I think this is something that Lynn and her colleagues at Energy Consumers Australia is very familiar with, is during sunny hours of the day, many prosumers produce more than they consume. So you produce that blue portion. And the blue portion is, let me put it this way, it's a huge headache for regulators. How much is that worth and how much should customers get paid for that, if anything? Some people think that, for example, in the California context, where we have excess solar in many days, in many seasons of the year, that's a nuisance. And in fact, customers shouldn't get paid for it at all. In fact, they should be penalized because they're feeding the grid at the worst possible time. In some countries, there's moratoriums on how many solar panels you can add to the grid. Hawaii, for example, kind of overdid it for a while and they put restrictions on it. So there's a lot of discussion about what to do with that. And that's where storage and electric vehicles actually, I think, can play a very important role. They can suck up that excess generation at a time where prices could be low or negative. So what more can you want? Free mobility, courtesy of your solar panels, let's say, or your neighbor's solar panels, for that matter. So anyway, electric vehicles are coming. I'm not going to diverge too much into this. They may or may not be driverless. There's a lot of interest in that. But it is a fact that distributed storage is likely to be here, and this is Elon Musk, as you know, with his power wall, and for those of you who are not familiar, the term prosumager basically is a prosumer who has now added storage to their portfolio of behind asset meters. So those are the kind of words that I work with. This, by the way, is the plant that Tesla has built in Nevada, and to produce lots of batteries, not just for the cars, but also for these Powerwall type devices. And then another interesting development, which again may be only of relevance to California, is that California Energy Commission, which sets standards for appliances and efficiency of buildings, building codes and so forth. I think a month ago, 2 months ago, I'm not sure exactly the date, but this proposal that was on the books for many years, but there was uncertainty whether the Commission would actually adopt it as a regulatory requirement, that was actually passed unanimously. So the 5 commissioners at CEC unanimously approved this as the new building code for California. So starting 2020, new residential buildings in California have to meet this standard, and there are some exemptions. If you're more than two stories, you don't have to do it. Or if you have a big high-rise next to you which shades your building, maybe you get an exemption, things like that. So there are some exemptions. But basically, the California regulators' vision is that individual homes would become self-sufficient on a net kilowatt-hour basis across a year, not by the day or whatever. And by the way, they're now considering this to be extended to commercial buildings in 2030. So I think that is kind of, you see the picture. For California to reach the 2045 goal of carbon neutrality, we've got to do all kinds of things, and in a hurry. Lots of electric vehicles, lots of efficient buildings, lots of efficient appliances, lighting, so forth and so on. So all of this has to happen for, if we have a chance of achieving that target. So, putting those pieces together, and this is, by the way, a picture and title of an article that showed up in Wall Street Journal, which I thought was very interesting. The American Home Builders Association had their convention in Las Vegas in that year, and the vice president of one of the largest home builders in America announced that they were going to build something like 7% of the homes they were going to build were going to be zero net energy. This is not because of some regulatory requirement. The people that were building these homes basically identified there's a segment of the population out there who's going to buy these homes, that this is profitable to do so. So it's just like anything else. If you're a home builder and people who buy homes want granite countertops in the kitchen, why not make that a standard product? Instead of putting something ugly and the customer has to come and replace it, take out the ugly countertops and put the granite countertops, well, why not make the granite countertops standard product? So that article really kind of caught my attention. Here's a home builder driven entirely by profit motive in a capitalistic America announcing that they're going to build, 7% of new homes they're going to build are going to be this category. So interesting things are happening, and not just because of California regulation. This is, of course, the Apple's headquarters, which is essentially operates as a zero net energy microgrid. This is the Renewable National Energy Lab in Boulder, Colorado, that operates as a zero net energy facility, except for the supercomputer, which is, when it's running, gobbles up huge amounts of kilowatt hours. But anyway, I guess we just have to think about a different future. People building, across the street, somebody's remodeling that big building, and I took a picture of it. It looks very nice, but I don't know if they're going to put the latest technology. For example, windows can be solar windows. The exterior of the buildings can be all solar panels. You can buy tiles like this, which you just cover the entire exterior buildings, and they become powerhouses. Solar windows which have different properties depending on whether you want light and heat, or just the light and no heat, or you don't want either. They can change their properties. And solar walls. This is a particular interesting product, and they have concentrated little things in the block, so you can build entire walls or sidewalks, if you will, and walk on them. Here's another example of innovation. This is a company based in Palo Alto called Solar Aurora. And they claim that all you need to do to get an estimate of whether your property is fit for solar panels is just give us the address. So, the Queen is concerned about electric bills, and she goes on the website and puts down Buckingham Palace and clicks. And the company gets an image of the Buckingham Palace, and these things you can easily get. And 10 minutes later, sends a proposal to the Queen, saying, if you put panels on such and such, and we know what the solar insolation is in London, and we know what the rates are, and Your Majesty can save this much by doing that. And yesterday at the conference, actually, there was a gentleman who was in the drones business, and he was showing the power of, you don't have to climb up the Buckingham Palace to get an exact detail of what the roof looks like. You can send a drone and get very detailed pictures. You can do whatever you want, get accurate information, and then put it together and decide what can be done. And to give you just another kind of sense of where things are going in crazy California, this is the city of Lancaster, which is north of Los Angeles. They recently passed a solar ordinance, one of the few cities in the world that I'm aware of. So for every square foot of living space, you have to have 2 watts of solar panels on the roof. I mean, that's how you get the building permit. And this being a bedroom community, builders build massive number of homes all at once. So the only difference is the builders put solar panels from day one. So consumers don't have to come in and then hire someone individually. You know how much a pain that is. You save 20% by doing it this way, as opposed to individuals hiring their individual installer to put solar panels on the roof. So if more cities and more countries had these types of initiatives, I think you could accelerate the behind-the-meter revolution. So you might say, well, why are we talking about this in 2018? Why didn't we talk about this 10 years ago or 5 years ago? Well, one reason is that just the technology to do the kinds of crazy stuff I talk about is truly arriving, or has already arrived. And innovation is just popping up all over the place. I don't know where the innovators were, until recently. But, a few years ago, if somebody said, think of a phone with a built-in camera, I would have thought of this, right? But now, you have, everywhere I go, in the places where exciting things happen, you see basically disruption and disruptors. And this, of course, is from a company that went belly up because they were disrupting they were a little bit ahead of their time. If you go to their website, it says this page cannot be found. But what is interesting about this picture? A, nobody has any ties. I'm the only one in this room, I think, has one. Everybody's young, which doesn't apply to me. They all have apples. There's fresh fruit on the table. There's a pet. Somebody's playing music. And they all seem very relaxed, even though they're probably working 20-hour days. And they probably love to go to work. At least that's what they say if you ask them. So it's a different environment. And these people essentially, these are the disruptors. They sit around thinking about existing companies typically with monopoly protection, or at least historically protected by monopolies, price controls and things like that, and they see opportunity to break that model and introduce a service at equally good service at lower cost, whatever that may be. So what are some of the interesting things, and I don't want to take too much time, and I'm not going to be talking about all of these in great detail, but one very imminent, and there are several companies working on it, is basically this concept of integrated energy services, where your home produces power. These are the Tesla solar tiles, a Tesla electric vehicle, and a Tesla power wall in the garage. So this is one person's vision, and Tesla is trying to get people excited in this idea. This is another company I just came across. It's called Solar or Sun Flare or Solar Flare, I'm not sure. So those tiles are also, the shingles are, the only challenge is you have to design, because these come in standard and they just snap together and are electrically connected. So you just have to make sure that the roof is proportioned to the size of these, just kind of like standard windows come inserted. So if you're an architect, you just have to design it so you don't have to cut the panel in half. But you can get very elegant roofs which look like normal roofs, but they're solar producing roofs. And of course the house, if it's efficient, if you think about a house like a refrigerator, if it's well insulated, it needs a small motor to keep the milk cool. So the house is the same way. If the house doesn't lose or gain a lot of heat and so forth, you need a small amount of solar to make it zero net energy. So let's spend just a couple of minutes on platforms, which I think is very interesting. This is what enables the future prosumers and prosumagers to go beyond where they currently can. They can trade their excess. So your excess solar, if you're not getting paid adequately or whatever you think is adequate, then you can share that with someone across the street or across town or across the state. And different, I don't want to get into, these are examples of actual companies that are sort of have different versions of platforms. For example, there's one in England which the platform allows trading of flexibility on the distribution network. So the 6 network operators, and I know someone here from Energy Australia is here. So these 6 companies have agreed to basically post congestion on the distribution network. And if you have a technology that can relieve the network, you can auction your solution as opposed to someone else. So the platform operator is not connected or has any stake in who's buying or selling or anything. So it's a neutral marketplace. And this is one of the interesting things about platforms. Platforms, if they're associated with the product or service, maybe people would not trust them. But if you have a platform that is neutral, it just offers a marketplace for people to buy and sell goods, in this case, electricity or flexibility services, and you basically capture their market before somebody else does, you can become quite profitable. Now, why are platforms interesting? I find this super fascinating, and I think I got a piece of information which I'll share with you, and I think it says quite a bit. This, by the way, the reason I put this is the example of a platform like FTD, where you can order flowers. There was a study done on platforms for flower delivery. Their profit margins tend to be 25 to 30%. So if you order a bouquet of flowers to be delivered to your mom on Mother's Day, which any son that wants to be left with some property after the mom dies would want to do, right? So if you pay $100 for that delivery, the farmer in Kenya that grows the flower, the airline that delivers the flowers, the cargo service, the local wood shop, flower store that arranges the flowers, the person that delivers it, they all get peanuts relative to the platform operator that gets a very heavy margin. Now, why is that? Because that is really what brings all those parties together and makes it possible for you, with few clicks, to deliver the flowers to your mom on Mother's Day. Bingo! That is worth something. So platforms, to make a long story short, clever platforms that offer this kind of service and reduce the headache and bring the parties together can be enormously profitable. The number I was going to share with you is 120 billion. Uber is about to go IPO, and it's valued at 120 billion, with a B. You add the market capitalization of the third largest auto manufacturers in the US, which is General Motors, Ford, and Fiat Chrysler, it doesn't add up to 120 billion. And this company essentially is a virtual company. It doesn't own anything, doesn't run anything, it just relies, it basically offers a convenient service via a platform. Now platforms, again, I don't want to get too much into it, depending on whether it's one way or sophisticated, where people can actually transact and do sophisticated things. The more sophisticated the transaction, the higher the value and the higher the margin that you could potentially capture. So platforms is very, very interesting topic, and I'd like it included in this next book project. And I'm looking for people who are more knowledgeable than I am. And the other one, of course, is virtual power plants. I'm not going to take too much of your time, but this is again another way of showing you the power of aggregation and why I think that's so important. This is a German company based in Cologne. I've visited them. I'm very familiar with this company. What they do is aggregate something like in excess of 5,000 members who collectively have 4.5 gigawatts of flexible generation, storage, or load. And depending on the price and conditions on the market, they basically send signals that dispatches that 4.5 gigawatts of capacity in a flexible and very productive way in the market. So everybody wins. The company gets money, the grid operator enjoys the flexibility offered, and customers get lower electric bills. And microgrids, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but just a few words about storage, and I think we mentioned this. Storage obviously becomes almost a trivial thing. If you go to a future like California or Hawaii, where you're trying to get 100% renewable, renewables are wonderful when they're available, but you cannot dispatch them. So that's the challenge. Whether it's sun or water, you get it when Mother Nature provides the free resource. In California, for example, we get lots of sunny days in the spring. It tends to be rainy, so we also get a lot of hydro, and it's also windy all at the same time. So you get tons of free electricity at the time the climate is mild and there's no air conditioning load. And then fast forward to August or July. The hydro dams are dry, the wind doesn't blow as much, certainly not in the hours that you need it, and the sun, of course, shines. But even the sun doesn't produce, is not as efficient when it's very hot. So that is the problem with the storage. So what do we do? Well, any kind of storage, utility scale, individual scale, more flexible load, that's virtual power plants. Again, you have to figure out a way. And this is really fundamental. This goes back to what I started. When I worked at Southern California Edison some years ago in the 80s, the world stopped at the customer's meter. We didn't ask or expect the customer to change their behavior or do anything, really. Now, I don't think we have that luxury. In the future, we have to ask the consumer to become active in the market. And so it's a given. It's not just something that's nice to do. I don't think we can get away with it. So I'm going to go through these quickly. You've seen the duck curve and things like that, which I'm not going to dwell on. And so let's just take a few minutes. I guess I have this and one more slide, just a couple of observations. First one is the fundamental question: what lies behind the meter? I mean, I don't know, but I'm guessing. Industry always talks about how many millions and billions they've invested in the infrastructure. Well, consumers have also invested billions in the infrastructure. We just never bothered to know what it was or how much it was. And give you an example. I have neighbors where I live that have solar panels on the roof. They have energy storage in the garage, and some of them have 2 Tesla vehicles in the same garage. You add up that, and it's $200,000 easily. And it's not utilized very efficiently. It's not integrated, so one house and the next one have nothing to do with each other. I mean, look at the opportunities wasted by not doing something a little smarter with those devices. What can be done with these assets? Well, I think we can enable them to become more proactive in the market in interesting ways. And how? Well, I guess the sad news is this is not easy. I talked to a company that is actually trying to do this, and I told him my vision. He listened patiently and had, sipped his wine or whatever. And he basically told me the last bullet. He says, that you don't know what you're talking about. This is not easy. Getting behind the meter assets to collaborate and coordinate and get permission. He was saying that they were doing an experiment, and they wanted to put 2,000 power walls in people's garages free of charge, just for the sake of manipulating and managing the battery storage and so forth. He said it was like pulling teeth. People didn't want a $20,000 gift to be placed in the garage for a variety of reasons. And it took a lot of effort just to give away 20,000 power walls. So it's we are at the frontier, and we have to discover what works and what doesn't, and maybe a lot of what I'm saying doesn't make any sense at the end of the day. But these are things that I like to ask people to contribute to, and I think the list is self-explanatory, so I don't need to repeat. But if any of these 5 topics or others that fit in this general mold that I talked about is of interest to you, I'd like to hear, and perhaps we can begin some discussion about where to go. Thank you very much.